She said it loud enough for the whole table to hear. Not a whisper, a performance. And she smiled while she did it, the kind of smile that knows exactly what it's doing. I didn't flinch. I just picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought, by the time this night is over, you're going to wish you'd never learned my name. I had driven 4 hours to be here. Not because my cousin Marcus had asked me to come, he hadn't. Not really. His text said, "You're welcome to stop by if you're in the area," which isn't an invitation so much as a legal disclaimer. But my mother had called 3 times that week, and my aunt had called twice, and eventually it felt easier to just show up than to explain, again, why I wasn't close to that side of the family anymore. My name is Maya. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a small town in central Ohio where the biggest employer was a distribution warehouse and the second biggest was a Dollar General. I left at 18 with a scholarship to a state school, dropped out after 2 years, and spent the next decade doing something my family never quite understood and never quite forgave me for. I built things, software mostly, tools for small businesses to manage their finances, their inventory, their payroll, nothing glamorous. Nothing that made headlines. Just quiet, useful work that people paid me for, and then paid me more for, and then slowly, then all at once turned into something I still had trouble believing when I looked at my bank statements. My family didn't know. That was my choice, and I'd made it deliberately. Not to punish them, not to set a trap, not for any dramatic reason at all. I'd kept it private because the one time I'd tried to share good news with that side of the family, the year I landed my first real contract, my aunt had said, "Well, it's not like you have a real career," and Marcus had laughed, and nobody had corrected her. So I learned to stop sharing. I kept sending money home to my mother, kept paying down my parents' second mortgage from an account they didn't know was mine, kept my name off anything my family might Google. It was easier that way, quieter. My mother knew I was doing okay. She didn't know the full picture. My father suspected more than he let on, I think, but he'd always been better at silence than questions. The wedding venue was a restored mill property about 40 minutes outside Columbus. Exposed brick, chandelier lighting, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a river. I'd seen the photos online and recognized the name of the property management company immediately, Hartwell Event Group, which was a subsidiary of a real estate holding company I'd invested in 3 years earlier during a particularly good quarter. I owned a 14% stake, which made me a minority partner, but still the second largest individual investor after the founder. I hadn't thought much about that connection until I pulled into the parking lot and saw the brass sign by the door. I was wearing what I'd worn to a board meeting that morning because I'd driven straight from Columbus. Dark slacks, a fitted blazer, low heels. My hair was up. I looked. I realized as I walked in, like someone who'd come from work, which I had. The rehearsal dinner was in the main hall. About 60 people, round tables with white linens, a bar along the far wall. Marcus was near the front with his fiancée, a woman named Cassandra, whom I'd met exactly once at Christmas 2 years ago. Cassandra was tall, blonde, and the kind of effortlessly polished that suggested money she'd been born into rather than money she'd worked for. Her family, the Hargroves, had driven up from Cincinnati. Her mother wore pearls. Her father shook hands with both of his and looked at every room like he was calculating what it was worth. I found my seat, table 7, near the back, next to a pillar, facing slightly away from the head table. I noted this without bitterness. It was exactly what I'd expected. The woman sitting next to me introduced herself as Cassandra's older sister. Her name was Diane. She was 38, maybe 40, in a red dress that fit like it had been commissioned. She had the kind of social confidence that fills a room without trying, the kind that makes other people shrink a little without quite knowing why. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds before she made her assessment. I watched her do it. The blazer, the lack of jewelry, the fact that I was sitting at table 7. "And how do you know Marcus?" she asked, in a tone that already contained the answer she expected. "He's my cousin," I said. "Oh." A small pause. "So you're from the Ohio side." She said Ohio the way some people say rural, not as a place, but as a condition. "I am," I said. She nodded and turned back to the woman on her other side. I didn't say anything else. I'd learned, a long time ago, that there was no version of "actually." I run a software company that didn't sound defensive when offered unprompted to someone who hadn't asked. So I ate the bread roll and listened to the room and waited. The toasts started after dinner. Marcus's best friend went first, then Cassandra's maid of honor. Then Cassandra's father stood up and gave a speech that was really more of a financial biography, the Hargrove family history, their business interests, the properties they owned, the boards they sat on. He said the word legacy 4 times. He said our family, as if it were a brand. Then he said something that made me set down my fork. And of course, we're so pleased that Marcus will be joining our family business. He has a real head for numbers, and we've already got him set up with a position at Hargrove Capital. The boy's going to do great things. The room applauded. My aunt beamed. Marcus looked pleased and slightly overwhelmed. I looked at my cousin and thought, do you know what Hargrove Capital actually is? Because I did. Not because I'd investigated them. I hadn't. I knew about Hargrove Capital the same way I knew about a lot of financial entities passively, through the network of people I'd built over a decade in the industry. A former colleague had mentioned them 8 months earlier during a due diligence conversation. Not as a warning, exactly. More as a, be careful. They've had some regulatory questions. The SEC had opened a preliminary inquiry the previous spring. Nothing public yet, nothing charged. But the kind of thing that people in certain circles knew about and mentioned quietly over coffee. I hadn't thought about it again until this moment. I picked my fork back up and told myself it wasn't my business. Dessert came. The room got louder, the way rooms do when the wine has been going for 2 hours. I was considering whether I could slip out early without anyone noticing when Diane leaned across the table toward the woman sitting across from me, one of Cassandra's college friends, and said, not quietly, "Did you hear Marcus's cousin came? The one who dropped out of college and does something in computers?" She said something the way you'd say nothing. The college friend glanced at me, then back at Diane. "Which one is she?" "Right there." Diane didn't lower her voice. "The one who looks like she came from an office temp assignment." There was a small ripple of laughter from the 2 women next to her. Not everyone at the table joined in. One older woman looked at her plate. A man across from me studied his wine glass. I put my napkin on the table. I thought about what I wanted to do. I thought about the 14% stake. I thought about the SEC inquiry. I thought about Marcus, who had never been particularly kind to me, but who was still blood, and who was about to sign his future over to a family with serious legal questions hanging over their finances. And I thought about something an attorney friend had said to me once, when I'd asked her how she decided when to speak and when to stay quiet. She'd said, "The question isn't whether it's your business. The question is whether staying quiet makes you complicit." I decided to go get some air. I found a quiet corridor off the main hall, sat down on a bench near a window, and called my attorney. Not because I expected her to answer at 9 on a Friday evening, but because I needed to leave a voicemail that organized my own thoughts. She answered on the second ring. "I'm at a family thing," I said, "and I think there might be a situation." I told her what I knew about Hargrove Capital. I told her about the SEC inquiry. I told her that my cousin was apparently about to accept a position with them. She was quiet for a moment. "How solid is your information on the inquiry?" she asked. "Second hand, but the source is reliable. Investment attorney out of New York. He mentioned it specifically in the context of recommending I not do business with them." "Okay," she said. "I'll make some calls tonight. Don't do anything until I get back to you." I sat with my phone for a while after I hung up. Through the corridor window, I could see the parking lot, the river beyond it, the lights reflecting off the water. It was a pretty venue. I tried to remember when I'd approved the investment, whether I'd toured the property or just reviewed the financials. I thought I'd just seen the numbers. When I went back inside, Diane was standing near the bar with 2 other women, and she stopped talking when I walked past. That particular silence, the kind that's louder than conversation, was one I'd learned to recognize early in life. I got a glass of water. I was standing quietly near the bar when Marcus came over. I hadn't spoken to him yet that evening. He'd given me a brief wave from across the room when I arrived, which was about what I expected. "Hey," he said, "you made it." I did. He was looking at me with that combination of affection and mild discomfort that had characterized our relationship for as long as I could remember. Marcus was fundamentally decent, I thought, just not particularly brave. "I'm glad you came," he said, and I believed him. "I need to talk to you," I said, privately. Not tonight, tomorrow, before the ceremony if you can manage it. It's important. He read something in my face. Is everything okay? I'm not sure yet, but I need you to hold off on signing anything with Hargrove Capital until we talk. Can you do that? He stared at me. How do you even know about that? Your dad made the toast. Marcus, please, just wait until I can explain. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. I went back to my table. Diane was watching me from across the room. I didn't look away from her gaze, and after a moment, she did. It was maybe an hour later when things shifted. Cassandra's mother had moved to a small group near our table and had been growing steadily more interested in why there was a woman in business casual at her daughter's rehearsal dinner. She asked my aunt, apparently because my aunt came over looking slightly flushed and said quietly, "Maya, honey, Diane is asking about you, about what you do. What did you tell her?" I said you work in tech. That's accurate. My aunt lowered her voice further. She asked if you work at a help desk. I almost laughed. What did you say? I said I wasn't sure exactly. She looked uncomfortable. You never really tell us. And there it was, the thing I'd kept quiet for years, the invisible wall I'd built, suddenly the reason my own family couldn't defend me. I'd protected my privacy so carefully that I'd accidentally left them without ammunition. It's okay, I said. Don't worry about it. But Diane had apparently decided she'd been patient enough. She walked over to our table with a glass of wine in her hand and that same practiced smile, and she said to the group, not to me specifically, loud enough for most of the nearby tables to hear, I've just been trying to figure out what our mystery guest does for work. Marcus says tech, but I'm having a hard time placing you. You don't exactly look like Silicon Valley. She said it as a joke. The kind of joke that isn't one. A few people laughed. A few looked away. My aunt looked at her shoes. I turned to face Diane directly. I'm a founder, I said. Software company. We build financial management tools for small and mid-sized businesses. Diane raised an eyebrow. Oh, so you're like a startup person. We crossed Series C funding 3 years ago, I said pleasantly, so I think we've graduated past startup. There was a brief silence. I could see her recalibrating, not retreating exactly, but adjusting tactics. Well, she said, I suppose every little business has to start somewhere. She turned to her mother. Remind me, what did Hargrove Capital manage last quarter? Was it 400 million or 5? Her mother smiled. 460, I think. But who's counting? They laughed. I thought about the SEC inquiry. I thought about my attorney, who was making phone calls right now. I thought about the symbolic irony of the fact that one of the venues in the Hartwell Event Group portfolio, the one we were sitting in at this very moment, had been acquired using capital that included my personal investment, which meant that in a technical and legal sense, I was a partial owner of the building these women were standing in. I didn't say that. Not yet. What I said was, 460 is a solid number. What sectors are they concentrated in? Diane blinked. It wasn't the response she'd expected. Private equity mostly. Some real estate. I said neutrally. Diversified or focused? I'm sorry? She looked slightly thrown. The real estate holdings. Diversified portfolio or focused asset class. Commercial, residential, mixed use. Her mother had gone slightly quiet. Mostly commercial, she said carefully. Interesting, I said, and I let the word sit there without following it up. I excused myself a few minutes later to step outside and check my phone. My attorney had sent a text that said, "Call me when you're free. The inquiry is broader than you knew. There's more." I walked to my car, which was parked near the back of the lot. I sat in the driver's seat with the door open and called her. What she told me took about 12 minutes. I listened without interrupting. The SEC inquiry into Hargrove Capital had been opened 8 months ago based on a whistleblower complaint from a former compliance officer. The allegation was that the fund had been misrepresenting asset valuations to investors, specifically inflating the reported value of commercial real estate holdings to attract new capital, while those same holdings were quietly being listed for sale at significantly lower actual values. It was, my attorney said, the kind of fraud that was hard to prove quickly, but extremely hard to explain away once the forensic accountants got in. 2 former employees had been cooperating with investigators for the past 3 months. How close are they to charges? I asked. My contact says weeks. Not months. Maybe sooner. Marcus is about to accept a position with them. A pause. That's a problem. I know. Maya, this is also bigger than Marcus. If you have evidence that other people are being brought into the organization while the fund's principals know about the investigation, that's potentially relevant to the investigators. I sat with that for a moment. Give me a name, I said. Someone I can call. She gave me a name and a number. I wrote them down. I sat in the car for a little while after I hung up. The moon was out. The river glinted past the tree line. I thought about whether I'd been right to come tonight, whether I should have just sent my regrets and stayed in Columbus and let things unfold however they were going to unfold without me. But then I thought about Marcus in that room, smiling, thinking he was stepping into a future, and I thought about how it felt to be 26 and believe that someone was offering you something real when they were actually just using you. I thought about things I'd had to learn without anyone warning me. I went back inside. The party was winding down. People were finishing drinks, saying goodbyes. Diane and her mother were near the exit with Cassandra, the three of them in a close cluster, and as I walked back through the main hall, I heard my name. Not a coincidence. Diane had timed it. Marcus's cousin, the one who dropped out. She's been interrogating my mother about Hargrove, apparently. I don't know what her issue is. Loud enough to carry. Not loud enough to be unambiguous. I think she might be one of those people who resents other people's success. I stopped walking. Cassandra looked at me. She hadn't realized I was close enough to hear, and something flickered across her face. Not quite regret. Embarrassment, maybe. The particular embarrassment of someone who wasn't as cruel as their company. Diane followed Cassandra's gaze and found me. She didn't flinch. I was just saying, she said pleasantly, that I hope you'll enjoy the wedding tomorrow, despite the long drive from Ohio. I looked at her for a long moment. Diane, I said, I genuinely hope tomorrow is a beautiful day for your sister. I left it at that. I found Marcus as people were filtering out and asked if he could meet me for breakfast. He said, yes, 7:30, the diner down the highway. I spent that night in my hotel room, a different property, not the Hartwell venue, with my laptop open, reviewing documents I hadn't looked at in months, my investment portfolio, the Hartwell Group financials, a few publicly available filings that told a partial story about Hargrove Capital's structure. I wasn't building a case. I wasn't trying to do anyone's job for them. I just needed to know exactly what I knew and what I didn't know before I sat across from my cousin at breakfast and tried to change the course of his life. I slept for 4 hours. I was up before 6. Marcus was already at the diner when I arrived, a coffee in front of him, looking like he hadn't slept much either. He looked at me with the wariness of someone who knows they're about to hear something they've been half expecting. I sat down. I ordered coffee. I told him what I knew. Not everything. Just what was relevant to him specifically, the SEC inquiry, the whistleblower, the timeline my attorney had described. I told him I had a contact who could tell him more and who could advise him on how to proceed. I told him I thought he should talk to his own attorney before signing anything with Hargrove Capital or with any entity connected to them. I watched him process it. How do you know all this? He asked. Because of what I do, I said. He looked at me differently then. The way people do when they realize the shape of something was wrong and they've just now seen the outline. Maya, what exactly do you do? So I told him. Not the full version, not the numbers, but the shape of it. The company I'd built. The investment portfolio. The reason I'd stayed quiet for so long and what that quiet had cost both of us. Marcus stared at the table for a while. Then he said, Does my mother know? No. Does anyone on our side know? My parents know I'm doing okay. They don't know the details. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked tired and young, and I realized, watching him, genuinely shaken, not by the Hargrove situation alone, by the realization of how wrong his mental picture had been. The money my parents got? He said slowly. The check that showed up when they were behind on the house, that was, yes. He looked at me. Why anonymous? Because at the time, I thought the story of where it came from would matter more to your parents than the help itself. I paused. I was probably wrong about that. We sat with that for a moment. What do I do about tomorrow? He asked. Get married, I said. Cassandra isn't her family. You get to decide what your marriage looks like, but don't sign anything until you've talked to an attorney. He nodded slowly. He looked like someone reorganizing a room in their head. He called me that afternoon, 2 hours before the ceremony. His voice was tight. "I talked to Cassandra," he said. "She knew about the SEC thing. She found out 3 months ago from her father. He told her it was nothing, a misunderstanding. She believed him." He paused. "She didn't tell me because she thought it would scare me off." "Is it going to?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to marry her," he said, "but I'm not taking the job." The wedding was small and genuinely lovely, in the chapel at the same venue. Cassandra cried during the vows. Marcus's hand shook slightly when he put the ring on her finger. I sat in the third row and thought that whatever came next, this exact moment was real. The reception was where things unraveled for the Hargroves. I was not the cause of it. I want to be clear about that. I had passed along what I knew to my attorney, who had passed it to the appropriate contact, and whatever chain of events that triggered was not something I designed or planned or controlled. I was sitting at table 4, a significant upgrade from table 7 the previous night, when 3 men in jackets who were very clearly not wedding guests came through the side entrance and asked, quietly, to speak to Gerald Hargrove. Diane saw them first. I saw her see them. She went very still in the particular way of someone who has been dreading a specific thing and has just watched it arrive. Cassandra's father stood up. He followed the men out with the measured composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his head. His wife stayed at the table and did not look at anyone. Diane's composure lasted about 4 minutes. Then she stood up and came directly to me. I don't know why she chose me. Maybe because I was the only person there she'd already identified as an adversary. Maybe because she was frightened, and frightened people need somewhere to direct it. "Did you do this?" she said. Her voice was quiet and hard. "I shared information I had with people whose job it is to act on it," I said. "I didn't create the situation. I just didn't pretend I didn't know about it. You had no right. My cousin was about to accept a position with a firm under federal investigation," I said. "I had every right." She stared at me. "Who are you?" she asked, and she meant it genuinely, not rhetorically, not as an insult, but as a real question from someone who had built an entire wrong picture. I told her about the Hartwell Group investment. I told her that the venue she was standing in was partially mine and had been for 3 years. I didn't say it to humiliate her. I said it because she'd asked a real question and it deserved a real answer. She sat down in the nearest empty chair. She looked out the window at the river for a long time. "I was rude to you last night," she said finally. "Yes. I thought you were nobody." "I know." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Is Marcus going to be okay? From the legal side, is he exposed?" And that surprised me. Not the question itself, but the genuine anxiety in it. It wasn't about herself. "He never signed anything," I said. "He's fine." She closed her eyes briefly. "Good." I found Marcus and Cassandra near the edge of the room. They were holding hands and watching the door through which her father had disappeared. Cassandra's eyes were wet, though she wasn't crying. She looked at me when I came over, and her expression was complicated gratitude and grief, and the beginning of something that hadn't formed a shape yet. "Is he going to be arrested?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "That depends on what they find and what he does next. You should both get an attorney." She nodded. She didn't let go of Marcus's hand. "I'm sorry about Diane," she said. "Last night." What she said. "It's okay." "It's not," she said. "It really isn't." I didn't push it. I just nodded. I said goodbye to my parents and my aunt, who were standing in a confused cluster near the bar trying to understand what had happened. My aunt grabbed my arm as I was leaving and said, "Maya, was that, did you?" and then couldn't find the end of the sentence. "Everything is going to be okay," I told her. "Make sure Marcus calls me next week." I drove back to Columbus that evening. The highway was quiet, and I had the windows down, and somewhere around the halfway point the sky turned that deep specific orange that only happens in Ohio in October, the kind of color that makes you understand why people love flat places. I thought about Diane asking me, "Who are you?" and how strange it had been to answer honestly after so many years of answering nothing. I thought about what I could have done differently, whether earlier honesty with my family would have changed anything, whether the secrets I'd kept had helped me or just made me lonelier in a way I'd confused for independence. I didn't have clean answers. I still don't. What I know is this. I spent years being quiet because I thought silence would protect me. And it did protect me. In some ways, from people who would have wanted things from me, from the exhausting performance of proving myself to people who'd already decided who I was. But it also meant that when someone stood across a table and called me nobody, the people who loved me didn't have the words to say otherwise. That was on me as much as anyone. The money I'd sent home over the years, the mortgage payments, the anonymous help, none of that had been a manipulation. None of it had been a trap. I'd done it because they were my family and because I could. But I'd wrapped it in so much secrecy that even my own mother couldn't tell someone, simply that her daughter had built something real. I think about what it would have looked like if I hadn't had any power in that room. If I'd been exactly what Diane assumed, a woman in business casual at a table near a pillar, unremarkable, easy to dismiss, would I have said anything? Would it have mattered? Probably not. And I don't have an answer for that. The justice that arrived at the Hargrove family's table arrived because of information I had access to, and access I had because of resources I'd built. I know how that looks. I know the question underneath it. I've thought about it a lot on that drive home, and I don't think the answer is to pretend the system is fair or that power is evenly distributed or that things tend to work out regardless of who you are. What I think is that I got lucky a long time ago, luck and stubborn work in proportions I can't fully separate, and that luck created options, and I used one of them. That's all. Marcus called me the following Wednesday. His voice was lighter than it had been in years, or maybe than it had ever been in my memory of it. He said Cassandra's father had retained counsel. He said they were looking at apartments in Columbus, away from the Cincinnati family orbit. He said Cassandra was angry and sad and working through it, and that they were figuring it out together. He said near the end of the call, "I wish I'd known you better all this time." "You can," I said. "That part's easy to fix." He laughed, a little shakily. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it is." I have a photograph from the wedding on my phone. Marcus and me, taken by my mother just before I left, standing outside the venue with the river behind us. I look tired. He looks like someone in the middle of a lot of feelings. We're both smiling, not for the camera, but because something had shifted between us, quietly, the way important things usually shift without announcement, without drama, just a door that had been stuck for a long time finally opening. I keep the photo because it reminds me that the version of myself I'd been protecting all those years, the private one, the careful one, the one who didn't share and didn't ask for anything and kept her own ledger with both hands, that version wasn't wrong? Exactly. But she was incomplete. I'm still figuring out the rest. I think that's probably how it's supposed to go.